It began with a whisper on a wire. A single coded message, 13 words, that would ignite one of the most secret wars ever fought. At first, it seemed meaningless. But in Washington, a handful of cryptanalysts leaned closer to the static, tracing every pulse of the Japanese transmission. They didn't know it yet, but they were about to dismantle an empire of shadows. The message read, "Climb Mount Nitaka 1208. To the untrained ear, it was a poetic nothing. To the Japanese Imperial Navy, it was an order, the final command to attack Pearl Harbor. In that instant, Japan's hidden hand reached across the Pacific, believing it had fooled the Americans completely. But behind closed doors inside a sealed room at the U.S. Navy Station HYPO in Hawaii, a silent war was already being fought, a war not with bullets but with numbers, fragments, and human obsession. For years, Japan had built an invisible army of spies, diplomats turned informants, radio operators buried inside embassies, merchants in Honolulu who passed coded weather reports disguised as business telegrams. They believed in their own perfection, the idea that the West could never read the East. But the Americans were reading everything. By 1941, the U.S. had already broken the Japanese diplomatic code known as Purple. Every secret message between Tokyo and its embassies passed through American hands first. Even before Japan attacked, the Americans knew its intentions. Not the date, not the target, but the heartbeat of a nation preparing for war. That single edge, born from patience and mathematics, would soon expand into one of the most brilliant and ruthless counterintelligence operations in history. And when Japan finally realized it had been watched the entire time, it was too late. This is the untold story of the Japanese spy network that collapsed before America's counterintelligence plan. A collapse that didn't just end missions but ended illusions. Japan thought it had built a web strong enough to strangle an empire. Instead, it wove the noose around its own neck. Before we begin, if you want more stories buried beneath the official records, stories of power, deception, and the men who shaped history from the shadows, subscribe now. What you'll hear in this film isn't just history, it's the anatomy of a silent victory. The war for information began long before Pearl Harbor burned. In the 1930s, Japan's militarists saw intelligence as divine work, a sacred duty to the emperor. The Army and Navy each maintained their own spy networks, rarely speaking to one another. Their agents operated from Manchuria to Manila, from San Francisco to Singapore. But they shared one fatal flaw: arrogance. In Tokyo, Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto warned his superiors that underestimating American intelligence would be a grave mistake. He knew the U.S. possessed minds capable of dissecting any code. But Japan's military elite dismissed the idea. They saw Americans as impulsive, soft, and incapable of subtlety. That arrogance would cost them everything. The Americans, on the other hand, were building an invisible fortress. At Station HYPO in Pearl Harbor, Commander Joseph Rockefort led a team that worked inside a windowless basement, their walls covered in strings of numbers, intercepted signals, and scribbled translations. They slept on cots beside their desks, living off coffee and cigarettes, obsessed with breaking every fragment that came through the radio waves. Rockefort's men were eccentric, brilliant, and half-mad, linguists, mathematicians, chess players, and puzzle solvers. They didn't look like soldiers, but they were fighting a war more decisive than any fleet. While Japan's spies sent weather reports disguised as market updates or shipping forecasts, American cryptologists intercepted them, decoded them, and mapped the patterns. They began to see through the fog, learning how the Japanese thought, how they hid information, how they repeated mistakes. And then came the trap. When the U.S. cracked the JN-25 code, Japan's naval encryption, it didn't announce it. It watched. It waited. Every transmission the Japanese sent was now a confession, whispered directly to their enemy. Tokyo's spy network began collapsing from within. In Hawaii, local Japanese agents, fishermen, shop owners, even photographers, had been feeding Tokyo reconnaissance data for years. They marked U.S. ship positions in harbors, troop counts, and aerial patterns. But after December 7th, everything changed. The FBI, Naval Intelligence, and Army G2 launched a silent purge. They tracked money transfers, followed radio frequencies, and infiltrated community networks. Within months, hundreds of suspected informants were under watch. The Japanese thought they were still invisible. But every word they spoke, every message they sent, was being translated before it reached home. The genius of the American plan wasn't brute force, it was patience. They didn't silence Japan's spies immediately. They let them talk. They let them transmit. Because each transmission led to another name, another route, another pattern. By 1943, Japan's once proud intelligence empire had turned into a map of ghosts. Dozens of its operatives vanished, arrested, turned, or fed false information by U.S. counterintelligence. The Americans began using them as puppets, sending back doctored reports that guided Japan into strategic traps. From the jungles of the Philippines to the waters of the Coral Sea, entire Japanese fleets would sail into battles already known, already calculated. Japan wasn't just losing at sea. It was being dismantled in silence. But the moment that sealed the fate of Japan's spy network came at Midway. There, the Americans staged one of the greatest counterintelligence maneuvers in modern history. And it began with a single lie. The plan began with a trick so simple it bordered on arrogance. In May 1942, the Americans intercepted a flurry of coded messages. They spoke of a target known only as AF. Tokyo ordered its fleet to prepare for a decisive strike. But where was AF? Was it Midway? Fiji? The Aleutians? The Americans needed proof, a way to bait the enemy without revealing their hand. So Rockefort devised a deception. He ordered the garrison at Midway to send an unencrypted radio message reporting a breakdown in their freshwater system. The Japanese intercepted it immediately. Hours later, Tokyo transmitted, "AF is short on water." That was it, confirmation. AF was Midway. Within days, Admiral Chester Nimitz set his trap. Every ship, every squadron, every submarine was placed in silence, waiting for Japan's fleet to emerge from the mist. When it did, the Americans were already there, hidden, patient, deadly. The Japanese believed they were striking by surprise. They didn't know their own codes had become weapons against them. 4 of Japan's most powerful carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, sailed straight into ambush. The Battle of Midway lasted just 3 days. But in those 72 hours, Japan's naval supremacy crumbled. Its intelligence officers couldn't explain how the Americans had anticipated every move, every change in formation. They searched for traitors within their own ranks. They found none. The truth was worse. They had been betrayed by their own confidence. After Midway, the Imperial Japanese Navy's faith in its spy network disintegrated. Every agent in Hawaii, Manila, and the Dutch East Indies came under suspicion. Tokyo purged its own men, burning their files, dismantling their radio stations, destroying years of carefully built networks. They thought they were preventing leaks. In reality, they were finishing the work the Americans had started. Japan's most dangerous spies were no longer those hiding in American cities. They were the ones being fed lies directly from U.S. counterintelligence. The Office of Naval Intelligence, working with the newly formed OSS, began crafting false trails. They created phantom fleets, ghost convoys, and fictitious invasions. Messages in Japanese codes, deliberately allowed to be intercepted, painted pictures of American vulnerabilities that didn't exist. And Japan believed every one of them. In the South Pacific, entire divisions moved toward mirages. Ships ran aground chasing empty harbors. Bombers flew into storms that led to nothing. Every false report cost Japan time, fuel, and men, resources it could never replace. The brilliance of the American counterintelligence plan was not its size but its subtlety. It didn't destroy Japan's spy network in open battle. It starved it of truth, of trust, of oxygen. Tokyo's intelligence channels became like veins pumping poison instead of blood. The Americans didn't have to kill Japan's spies. They only had to let them keep talking. And talk they did. By 1944, with Japan's fortunes collapsing across the Pacific, its intelligence corps grew desperate. Tokyo expanded recruitment, pulling in students, immigrants, and merchant sailors to gather scraps of information. But the Americans had already infiltrated most of their relay chains. Each message Japan sent home was intercepted, duplicated, rewritten, and sent back through the same route. Japan's network had become a puppet theater, every movement controlled by invisible American hands. At the center of that silent web was a man few have ever heard of, Lieutenant Commander Edwin Layton, intelligence officer to Admiral Nimitz. Layton had once studied in Japan, spoke the language fluently, and understood the cultural logic of his adversary better than anyone. He knew Japan's fatal flaw, its belief that loyalty could overcome logic. and so he weaponized it. Layton's team fed Tokyo a series of half-truths, information believable enough to seem authentic, misleading enough to lead disaster. When Japan learned of supposed American supply shortages, it rushed to exploit them, only to walk into prepared ambushes. When Japanese agents reported on weak Pacific outposts, those outposts were already fortified, waiting. Every false success Japan celebrated only deepened its defeat. The war of spies had turned into a hall of mirrors. Every reflection Japan saw was of itself, proud, confident, blind. By late 1944, as American bombers reached the Japanese mainland, the empire's intelligence web had completely collapsed. What remained were fragments, stray agents without orders, operating on instinct and rumor. The men in Tokyo still received reports, still drew maps, still issued commands. But the world they imagined no longer existed. Meanwhile, the Americans had mastered a new form of warfare, information as a weapon. They had proven that you could win a war before it began, if you could read the enemy's mind. The collapse of Japan's spy network didn't happen overnight. It was death by translation, every word twisted, every message turned against its maker. And the lesson buried inside it was timeless. The greatest illusion of power is believing you cannot be watched. After the war, as the ashes settled and generals stood trial, most of Japan's intelligence files were gone, burned in the last days before surrender. What survived revealed a pattern almost tragic in its repetition. Brilliant men blinded by faith, soldiers betrayed by their own secrets, and a nation that never understood it had been outwitted long before it was defeated. The Americans had built their counterintelligence network not from arrogance, but from fear, fear of another Pearl Harbor, fear of the unknown. But from that fear came precision. From obsession came mastery. And when Japan finally surrendered in August 1945, its generals were still asking one question: when did they start knowing everything? The truth was simple. They had always known. The war in the Pacific was fought with fire and steel, but beneath it ran a quieter conflict, one of language, logic, and code. While fleets clashed at sea and cities burned from the sky, the real victory was taking place in rooms without windows, where men listened to ghosts through static. The Japanese called their intelligence officers shuriken, men of vision. The Americans simply called theirs the code breakers. And in that contrast lay the entire story of the war. Japan believed vision could outsmart numbers. America proved that numbers could destroy empires. Even now, decades later, historians still argue whether Japan ever had a chance. Could its intelligence corps have matched the analytical power of the U.S. Navy's cryptologic teams? Perhaps, if it had understood that pride is not a strategy. If it had shared intelligence instead of hoarding it, if the Army and Navy had cooperated, if commanders had trusted analysts rather than dismissed them as clerks. But they didn't. And history rarely forgives those who underestimate their enemies. The collapse of Japan's spy network was not just the fall of a system. It was the unraveling of a national myth, the belief that discipline could replace doubt, and devotion could outthink reason. For America, it was the birth of a new doctrine, that intelligence is not merely information but foresight. That the quietest victories are often the ones nobody sees. They called it Operation Magic. It sounded almost childlike, something harmless, something distant. But by 1944, it had become the beating heart of America's war machine, an invisible force guiding fleets, deciding battles, and reshaping the Pacific one intercepted message at a time. From a small cluster of rooms in Pearl Harbor, the United States was watching Japan disintegrate in real time. Each new transmission from Tokyo was like a ghost signal, faint, desperate, bleeding through the static of defeat. And every ghost told a story. One report spoke of missing convoys near Truk Lagoon. Another detailed supply shortages in Rabaul. A third described enemy submarines sighted near the Marianas. To Japan, these were urgent dispatches to preserve what little control it had left. To America, they were whispers of a dying empire, signals mapped, decoded, and used to strike before Japan could even move. By that year, the U.S. had learned to predict Japan's behavior not through guesswork, but through language itself. The way an officer phrased his report, the number of kanji used in a phrase, the rhythm of a coded message, all of it spoke of urgency, of weakness, of fear. The Americans no longer needed spies on the ground. The words themselves were the spies. Meanwhile, in the occupied territories, Burma, the Philippines, the Dutch East Indies, Japan's human networks were unraveling. Where once their agents had moved confidently among colonial traders and diplomats, now they moved in silence, hunted by American and British intelligence units trained in counter-sabotage. In Manila, one of Japan's most effective operatives, codenamed Tiger Lily, was captured while attempting to transmit a coded message using a hidden radio inside a monastery. When interrogated, she admitted something remarkable, that she hadn't received a direct order from Tokyo in months. The lines had gone dead. The network was crumbling faster than anyone in Japan could understand. By mid-1944, what remained of the Japanese intelligence system was little more than a patchwork of isolated cells, each convinced it was still serving a vast empire of coordination and power. But the empire they served was gone, replaced by American misdirection, double agents, and silence. In Saipan, Japanese officers gathered around a flickering lamp to read what they thought were authentic intelligence reports smuggled from Hawaii. They planned a counterattack based on those reports. But the reports were fake, carefully crafted by American intelligence using intercepted Japanese code patterns, then reinserted into the same transmission channels Japan still believed it controlled. The counterattack ended in slaughter. The power of deception was no longer in the hands of spies, it was in the hands of linguists and analysts who never left their desks. For Japan's intelligence officers, the war had become a hall of echoes. Every signal they received was a reflection of something already gone. Every victory they imagined was an illusion drawn by their enemy's hand. Still in Tokyo, a handful of officers refused to accept defeat. Among them was Colonel Hattori Takashiro, a brilliant strategist once assigned to coordinate the Army's intelligence network across the Pacific. He believed that Japan's failure lay not in its methods, but in its faith, that America had somehow stolen its soul of warfare through technology. In a classified memo dated March 1945, Hattori wrote, "The enemy has mastered the invisible. We have mastered nothing." He wasn't wrong. The Americans had learned to fight a new kind of war, one in which knowing the enemy was more valuable than killing him. Every intercepted message, every code fragment, every captured operative became a piece of a puzzle that revealed the mind of the Japanese command. By spring 1945, that puzzle was nearly complete. Japan's every move could be predicted with mathematical precision. When Japan planned a supply convoy to Okinawa, the Americans already knew the coordinates before the ships even left port. When Japanese submarines tried to break through blockade lines, U.S. destroyers were already waiting. When Tokyo ordered secret reinforcements to Iwo Jima, American intelligence tracked the movement through intercepted logistics codes, then sent bombers to annihilate the convoy at sea. The empire that once dreamed of mastering the Pacific was now a prisoner of its own words. Yet, in the chaos there were still moments of defiance, fragments of loyalty that refused to die. In Borneo, a Japanese spy named Masao Saito continued to transmit coded weather updates long after Tokyo had stopped replying. He used a broken radio and a hand-cranked generator salvaged from a wrecked aircraft. He sent the same report every dawn for 83 consecutive days. No one ever answered. After the war, his final transmission was found by Australian troops. It read only, "Still watching the sea." It was both a confession and an epitaph. The men of Japan's intelligence corps were not cowards or fools. Many were highly trained, deeply devoted, and willing to die for the emperor. But they had been sent into a war already lost, not by weapons but by information. They were soldiers fighting shadows. The Americans, meanwhile, had begun shaping the future. The intelligence lessons of the Pacific would soon become the blueprint for the Cold War. The codebreakers of Pearl Harbor evolved into the architects of the NSA. The analysts of the OSS became the foundation of the CIA. The shadow war that began against Japan would never end. It would only change names from magic to signal intelligence, from counterespionage to national security. And Japan's defeat would serve as a permanent reminder. In modern warfare, truth itself is the first casualty, and the last weapon. When Japan finally surrendered in August 1945, its intelligence archives were burned, its agents scattered, its leaders silent. In the ruins of Tokyo, U.S. officers walked through buildings still warm from the flames, collecting scraps of paper, fragments of ciphers, codebooks half destroyed, the remains of a network that once believed it could see everything. In one of those rooms, a young American interpreter found a note pinned to a wall, written in English, "We failed not because we were blind but because we refused to see." The handwriting was elegant, deliberate, the mark of an educated officer. No one ever claimed it. And so ended Japan's dream of invisible conquest. Its empire of spies, its coded pride, its belief in destiny, all undone not by strength but by perception. For the United States, it was a triumph of intellect, discipline, and patience. A demonstration that victory can be earned not just on the battlefield but in the mind. For Japan, it was a lesson carved in silence. That the greater the illusion of control, the greater the fall when it breaks. The Pacific War had ended. But the echo of that invisible struggle, the war of signals, lies and listening, would define the world for decades to come. In the final months of the war, Japan's empire was no longer an empire, it was an echo. Cities were ash. The military still barked orders into broken telephones, but no one was left to answer. And within the ruins of its intelligence core, men who had once commanded vast webs of spies sat in silence, staring at blank maps. Colonel Hattori Takeshiro wrote his last memorandum in July 1945. It was never officially filed. It began with a single line, "The enemy knows us better than we know ourselves." He wasn't exaggerating. By then, American counterintelligence had reached levels of precision unseen in warfare. Every Japanese communication channel, diplomatic, military, naval, had been penetrated, analyzed, and mirrored. The U.S. Army Signal Intelligence Service monitored Tokyo's remaining embassies, reading their messages before they even reached Japan. The Office of Naval Intelligence had dismantled every maritime spy ring between Guam and Shanghai. Even the most loyal agents no longer knew whether their words reached their superiors or their enemies. Tokyo continued to issue commands, but those commands traveled through a maze of silence and illusion. Messages bounced from one compromised operator to another, often intercepted, translated, and altered before they returned home. Entire operations, sabotage attempts, troop movements, clandestine supply runs, were planned on information the Americans had written themselves. What Japan believed was still a spy network had become an elaborate theater of ghosts. In the Philippines, captured radio logs revealed an extraordinary discovery. Japanese intelligence officers had been unknowingly relaying American forgeries for nearly 6 months. Coded maps and troop data fabricated by U.S. operatives pretending to be Japanese commanders in Burma. When these reports reached Tokyo, they were accepted as truth, setting off a chain of decisions that led to the annihilation of Japan's 31st Army near Impel. That was the perfection of America's counterintelligence, to make the enemy destroy itself. The strategy wasn't born from cruelty but from necessity. After Pearl Harbor, America had learned that knowing was not enough. It had to control what the enemy believed. It was no longer about intercepting secrets. It was about rewriting them. Behind this silent domination stood a new generation of thinkers. Mathematicians turned spy masters, linguists turned tacticians. People like William Friedman, the quiet genius who had helped break the Japanese Purple Code, and Joseph Rockefeller, the obsessive analyst who had foreseen Midway. They were not warriors in the traditional sense. They didn't fire weapons or lead armies. But they redefined the battlefield, turning language, logic, and illusion into instruments of power. Friedman once wrote, "To read the mind of the enemy is to live inside his future." That philosophy became the foundation of post-war American intelligence. When Japan finally capitulated on August 15, 1945, it wasn't only its military that surrendered, it was its way of thinking. For years, the Imperial Command had believed that discipline could replace innovation, that secrecy alone could ensure superiority. But secrecy without adaptability is a tomb. By the time Japan realized it, the tomb was already sealed. The United States walked through the wreckage with precision. Intelligence officers collected burned codebooks, salvaged intercept equipment, and interrogated surviving members of Japan's Tokumu Kiken, its special service agencies. What they found shocked even them. Japan's intelligence structure had never truly been unified. The Army and Navy ran separate systems, each competing for the emperor's favor, each hoarding data the other might use. Their networks abroad overlapped, contradicting one another, duplicating missions, wasting resources. There was no central coordination, no shared code standards, no unified doctrine of counterintelligence. To the Americans, who had built a single, cooperative machine of information, Japan's chaos was almost incomprehensible. It explained everything. The arrogance, the confusion, the collapse. One U.S. report written in 1946 summarized it simply: Japan's intelligence failed not in will but in method. Its eyes were sharp, but each looked in a different direction. That failure became a case study, the dissection of an empire undone by its own divisions. As the occupation began, General Douglas MacArthur's administration systematically dismantled Japan's intelligence apparatus. Surviving officers were interrogated, many quietly absorbed into post-war bureaucracies, others vanishing into obscurity. The tools of espionage, code machines, encrypted typewriters, training manuals, were confiscated or destroyed. In their place, the Americans built something new, a network not of spies but of influence. This was intelligence as reconstruction. Rather than eliminate Japan's intellectual class, U.S. strategists co-opted it. They replaced the pursuit of imperial secrets with the pursuit of American ideals: democracy, transparency, technology. Information, once a weapon of the emperor, became a tool of rebuilding. But beneath the surface, the quiet rivalry never ended. The ghost of Japan's intelligence service lingered, its former agents now scholars, its analysts turned corporate pioneers. Some would go on to shape Japan's new post-war institutions, turning lessons of failure into frameworks for efficiency, secrecy, and innovation. Meanwhile, in Washington, the success of Operation Magic evolved into something even larger. In 1952, the creation of the National Security Agency institutionalized the methods born from the Pacific War. What had once been a desperate race to read the enemy's codes became a permanent system of surveillance, one that would stretch across the globe, reaching far beyond the islands of Japan. The ghost of Midway, the echo of those intercepted messages, lived on in every satellite, every wiretap, every signal later captured during the Cold War. The silent victory over Japan had created a new kind of empire, an empire of listening. And yet, amid the triumph, a quiet unease lingered. Some of the men who had built America's counterintelligence system understood what it meant to wield such invisible power. Rockefort died in 1976, unrecognized by most of the nation he had helped save. Friedman suffered a mental breakdown years after the war, haunted by the ethical weight of his own genius. They had glimpsed something intoxicating, the ability to control truth itself, and it had terrified them. The collapse of Japan's spy network had proven one thing beyond question: that knowledge could defeat might. But it also revealed a darker truth: that knowledge could corrupt just as easily as it could save. After the war, as the world rebuilt, the United States inherited not just Japan's intelligence victories, but its temptations. The same precision that had saved American lives at Midway now became a blueprint for total surveillance. The same deception that had ended an empire would one day be turned inward, on allies, on citizens, on itself. Every empire of intelligence carries its own undoing. Japan had learned it through arrogance. America would learn it through ambition. And history, as always, would remember neither the first whisper nor the final silence, only the illusion that someone was ever in control. It ended the way all wars end, not with victory but with silence. Tokyo was dust. The emperor's voice echoed over the radio for the first time in history, trembling, distant, barely human. Men who had once killed in his name wept in the streets. And somewhere in a quiet room in Washington, an American analyst folded up his last decoded message and placed it in a drawer. The war of shadows was over. But in truth, it had only changed shape. The collapse of Japan's spy network was more than a tactical triumph. It was a revelation, proof that the human mind could be mapped, that thought itself could be measured, predicted, and weaponized. What began as the cracking of codes had become the cracking of humanity. For Japan, the war ended in surrender. For America, it ended in realization that knowledge, once tasted, could never be forgotten. The men who had broken Japan's secrets had also broken something inside themselves. They had peered too deeply into the machinery of deception and found that it worked because it was built from human nature: pride, fear, loyalty, and doubt. The same forces that had destroyed Japan's intelligence network were alive in every nation, every empire, every government that believed it could see everything. History would repeat that cycle again and again. In the years that followed, the echoes of Operation Magic stretched across the New World Order. The Soviet Union, learning from Japan's mistakes, built its intelligence network on paranoia and control. America responded with a mirror image: surveillance instead of spies, systems instead of soldiers. Both sides believed they had mastered the invisible. Neither realized they had become prisoners of it. The Cold War was not born in Berlin or Moscow. It was born in the static of those intercepted Japanese transmissions, in the belief that whoever could hear first would rule forever. And yet, for all its triumph, the American counterintelligence plan against Japan carried within it a quiet warning. Every victory built on deception leaves a residue, a question of what was real and what was not. When the codebreakers of Pearl Harbor looked back on their war, they saw not glory but ghosts. Ghosts of men they had outsmarted. Ghosts of messages they had twisted. Ghosts of lives ended by words they had rearranged. They had won without ever being seen, and that invisibility haunted them. In the ruins of Tokyo, the Japanese intelligence officers who survived the war faced a different kind of reckoning. They had believed that devotion could outthink logic, that secrecy was strength, that loyalty was armor. But devotion blinded them. Secrecy isolated them. Loyalty chained them to a collapsing system that demanded faith even as it fed them lies. They had been loyal to a dream, one that vanished the moment they tried to measure it. 4 years after the war, many of them lived in obscurity. Some joined the new Japan self-defense forces. Others became businessmen, teachers, quiet men who never spoke of what they had seen. But sometimes, late at night, they would hear a sound, a faint signal on a forgotten radio frequency, and remember what it felt like to believe in an empire that no longer existed. The silence after war is never truly silent. It hums with memory, of codes cracked, lives lost, and truths too dangerous to speak aloud. The Americans who inherited Japan's secrets built an empire of their own, one that watched the world through cables and satellites, intercepting signals from nations that hadn't even been born yet. But every transmission, every whisper, carried the same danger that had destroyed Japan's intelligence service: the illusion of control. Because in the end, no system, not even the most sophisticated one, can ever predict the human heart. It is the one code that cannot be broken. That was the hidden lesson of the Pacific. Not that intelligence wins wars, but that arrogance loses them. That power built on secrecy is power built on sand. And that every empire, no matter how vast or vigilant, will one day be undone by its own reflection. The Americans never forgot the victory at Midway or the brilliance of Operation Magic. But those triumphs came with a cost: the quiet birth of a world that would never again know privacy or trust. They had defeated an empire that believed it could not be seen, only to become an empire that saw too much. The historian Edwin Layton, in his final years, wrote that knowledge is a weapon that grows sharper with use, and heavier to carry. He had carried it his entire life, and it had cut deep. For Japan, the scars were different. Its defeat forced it to look inward, to rebuild, to redefine itself not through conquest but through creation. The engineers, mathematicians, and scientists who had once built encryption machines now built radios, calculators, and cameras. Its obsession with precision turned from war to innovation. And in a quiet irony, the same meticulous discipline that had failed Japan in espionage would later make it a technological superpower in peace. Every empire leaves behind its lessons. America learned that intelligence is power. Japan learned that power without truth is blindness. But for both, the real war was never between nations. It was between certainty and humility, between what they could see and what they chose not to. The story of the Japanese spy network that collapsed before America's counterintelligence plan is not just a story of codes and deception. It is a story of humanity itself, of how pride disguises ignorance, how faith distorts fact, and how, in the pursuit of absolute knowledge, we risk losing the very thing that makes us human: doubt. Because doubt is the beginning of wisdom. And wisdom, unlike power, survives the fall of empires. So, as the lights fade and the screen darkens, remember this: the war of information never truly ends. It only changes its name. And somewhere, right now, someone is listening, believing they are the first to know, the first to see, the first to control. They are not. The cycle continues. The shadows never sleep. And the silence that follows is never silence at all. If you've made it this far, you already know. History doesn't repeat itself. It decodes itself. Subscribe, stay curious, and remember, the greatest secrets are never hidden in codes. They're hidden in people.